Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to wait a couple minutes to get started. So go ahead and just make sure you're on mute, and we'll go ahead and get started here momentarily. We're going to give it about one more minute, and then we're going to go ahead and get started. All righty, you guys, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. It is 1 o'clock. So thank you all so much for joining us today. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Courtney Leffler, and I am from Headwaters RC&D here in Butte. And I'm very excited to be your guys' room host for this breakout session. And we're very, very excited that you guys joined us today for this session. I know you guys are going to learn a lot, and I think it's going to be an awesome session. If you guys don't mind, please go ahead and mute your lines. And we're going to hopefully utilize that chat box at the bottom of your screen for any questions you may have during the presentation. And Karissa is going to go ahead and monitor that chat box. So we will get to your question. Just be patient with us, and please make sure to use that chat box and make this as interactive as we can since we are virtual. We're going to try to address all of the questions before the end of the session. Just a few housekeeping items. All of these sessions are being recorded. So go ahead and please mute your lines, turn off your video while the presenters are presenting. This will help with internet connection and just make sure we have a solid connection through the presentation. And if you guys don't mind, in the chat box, I saw some people already put their name and where they're from and their organization. So if you haven't done that, please go ahead and do that. It'll give us an idea of where you guys are from, and hopefully we can get you in contact with people in your area. And then at the end of the session, we will ask you to turn your video back on for question and answer. And one more final announcement, each of you guys should have received a little whiteboard paddle, and I'm sure you've been using it throughout the session, but go ahead, if you find something inspiring, exciting, new, write a quick adjective on it and hold it up at the end of the session. And we can talk about, what you guys thought was interesting, exciting, something you learned. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to the presenters here momentarily. But before we get going, thank you guys again so much for joining us for day 2 of the housing conference. Today, you guys have some very awesome presenters. We have Karissa Trujillo from Homeword and Alec Ramsing from Homeword. And we also have Zeke, Campfield, and Jane Kisselbach from Missoula Interfaith Collaborative. So you guys are going to be in great hands. I know they have some great information for you. Like I said, if you guys have questions, put it in the chat, and we are going to go ahead and begin. So Karissa, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great, thank you. Alex, if you want to advance the slide, that would be great. So I'm going to start out by talking about the current state of Missoula County's housing market. And our goal today is to sort of talk through 2 programs that try to provide a spectrum of support for landlords and the people that we're hoping that they will rent to, specifically folks with barriers to accessing rentals, and some community-focused solutions that have come up in the last couple of years that we want to share with you. And consider conversations afterward about similar programs you may have in your communities, or if you're interested in implementing something similar in your community. We'd love to just have a Q&A after. Our presentation's not super long. We'd love for this to be interactive if folks have questions. So I'm going to do a quick snapshot of what the current status is for housing in Missoula County. I think a lot of you are seeing this, especially for those of you who are in more major metropolitan areas in Montana, although I think kind of statewide we're struggling with housing. So you can see some statistics here. We're dealing with less than 1% vacancy rate for rentals in Missoula. And you can see in that first bullet in 2020, we did have as high as a 4% vacancy rate, but really with COVID-19, we've seen a real decrease in availability in an already kind of tenuous rental market. There was a Missoula Current article yesterday that actually quoted that there was an increase of 9%, the average rent, and that some folks are reporting increases as large as 50% in rental because, you know, market driven rent, if there's a low vacancy rate, there's lots of people looking, and that provides the opportunity for folks to raise rent. And so we're seeing that, definitely seeing that saturation. As far as home purchase price goes, in April 2021, you can see there are 406,500, and listings only spent 77 days on the market. So it's really quick turnarounds. We are definitely hearing from folks that there's sort of the Zoom boom happening. No actual hard data on that, just conversational data that we're getting a lot of sight unseen, 50,000 over asking price cash offers, especially early on in the pandemic. A lot of folks coming out to the Big Sky Country. Again, I think probably really similar to what other folks are seeing in their communities. And then you can see since 2001, we've had an increase of over 153% of the median home sales price. And then sort of so another kind of bellwether that we see as far as folks who are maybe harder to find homes, people with barriers to housing, lower incomes, is our housing choice vouchers. And so you can see some statistics there that our wait list is up, and the number of applied versus issued is really tough. You know, our voucher programs work really hard to get as many and have had increased number of vouchers available, but the need just severely outweighs what is available. And then getting those 4,112 voucher holders into homes then poses an additional challenge for the community. So the two programs we're going to talk about are working to kind of combat that challenge there. So Alex, if we go to the next slide. All right, so some challenges we faced this last year, and I'm specifically talking about the landlord liaison position, which Alex is going to speak to here momentarily. We had an eviction moratorium. You all are akin to that, and that was really hard for landlords and property managers then who were being asked to maybe take a riskier, perceived or real riskier renter, because they were already worried about their bottom line. They were worried that they weren't going to be able to make their mortgage with an eviction moratorium if someone wasn't able to pay their rent. And so they weren't necessarily interested in taking on any kind of new risk. And then COVID made it harder for us to communicate with landlords. You know, when you can't meet with somebody face to face, it's harder to build a relationship over Zoom. And they were stressed. The landlords in our community were really stressed out about just what was happening. They had their own personal challenges as well as their business end of the challenges. And so that was really harder for us when we were trying to maneuver a new program amidst COVID. And then next slide, please. Again, I already spoke about this, but another challenge that we faced in this last year of our program was the housing market, and the challenges with the low vacancy rates really demotivated landlords and property managers to work with the folks that our two programs were really wanting to support, those folks with real or perceived barriers to accessing housing. And when we speak about accessing or barriers to accessing housing, we mean things like, you know, previous incarceration, low credit scores, no rental history or poor rental history, eviction record, those sorts of things. And as I said, we also have had anecdotal evidence that we have some smaller landlords who are choosing to sell their properties because the housing market has just boomed, and that's where they can really make their profit. And so we're seeing a lot of renters forced from their homes into what is already a limited rental supply. And there's a group that's also impacted by this, in addition to our renters with high barriers, and that's folks who are trying to have upward mobility, people who 3 years ago would have, they've got their solid jobs and they're ready to move from renting to home ownership, and they just don't have anywhere to move to. And that upward mobility has been a real challenge for folks. We hear folks, working for the Forest Service and ready to buy, but there's just nothing in their price range now. The wages and home prices are just disparate there. So next slide, I think, is yours, Alex. Is that right? Yeah. So I'm going to hand it over to Alex. I just was kind of given a pulse. I get the negative part of the presentation, the sort of humdrum, but I think that we're all kind of feeling that in our communities. This statewide housing crisis, definitely feeling it in Missoula. And I read articles about Bozeman and Helena, Great Falls, all kind of managing those sorts of pressures. So Alex is going to start by talking a little bit about one of the programs that we implemented to try to help folks with barriers get access to more rental homes despite all of those challenges that we faced.
Thanks, Karissa. Hey, everyone. I am the landlord liaison with Missoula County. I'm Alex Ramsing. So I run a couple of different programs through Homeword, the first being the Property Partner Program. So property partners are any landlord or property manager that chooses or agrees to reduce a barrier or barriers, perceived barriers, I always like to say, of their choice for folks who take my RentWise workshop. And this is always really important to talk about with landlords. I'm not here to strong arm anyone. I'm not here to say, will you sign this agreement or anything like that. My main goal at the end of the day is to support landlords to keep folks in their home. That is the ultimate goal at the end of the day. So landlords, it's always going to be their choice what barrier or barriers they choose to reduce. And I'm here to support them. Whether it be finding, connecting their tenant or their renter with a caseworker if they've had one in the past, or providing the landlord with resources and how to navigate those resources and who to contact and things like that so they can keep their renter in their home. And as we found too, in the last year, is that anyone can be a risky renter at the end of the day. We saw a lot of upheaval this last year with a lot of folks and people that have been stable workers and great tenants and great renters, all of a sudden struggle to pay rent. And I've had a few landlords contact me and say, hey, my tenant is a they work in restaurants and they haven't been able to work for a while. Where can we go? What can I do so I can keep them in? And that's been exactly what I'm here for. So while the Property Partner Program is really important, and I celebrate every time I get a landlord or property manager to sign on, as Karissa said, during COVID, a lot of landlords I think have been a little bit more hesitant to sign on to the program. Right now I have I have 13 property managers and landlords. So I have 6 property managers and then 7 private landlords that are on board with the Property Partner Program. So pretty exciting. So we launched this program March 1st of 2020, which ended up being kind of a rough time to launch a program like this. So every landlord that I've had that has signed on has been really exciting. And like I was saying, the Property Partner Program is important, but I've really pivoted my focus just to get my contact information out there to say to the landlords, if you are having an issue with a tenant, please contact me so we can figure out some way that we can keep them in their home, so we can move forward and keep them in that home. So I mentioned before, RentWise, I teach a 2-hour long workshop called RentWise. It focuses on a lot of different things to help tenants. We talk about credits, different resources for finding homes, landlord's perspective and overcoming barriers, and then tips to becoming just a great tenant, which always revolves around communication. I really hammer on that quite a bit in that last section because I think communicating with your landlord is really important. Something else that we've started doing recently is the monthly coffee talk. I've done 2 so far that have been really successful. So the first one was really just sort of a meet and greet, trying to introduce myself to as many landlords as possible. And we had a really great showing. In the second one, we had a special guest talk about different voucher programs. So we were kind of doing bird's eye view what are the different voucher programs, and seeing what people, if they had, specific questions about voucher programs, potentially in the future, we can have, folks from different organizations come present about their programs as well. So trying to keep these as really conversational, just a place, whether a landlord or a property manager is a property partner or not, to just drop in, ask questions. I think next month we're going to have another one about the Montana rental assistance program. I think we're going to have someone from the food bank who can talk some more about that. They do a lot of work with helping folks navigate the application process. So I was going to have them as a special guest as well. So that should be pretty exciting too. The last thing I manage is something called the Risk Mitigation Fund. This program is, I like to think of it as a way to sort of grease the wheels with landlords. So if a landlord is really hesitant to rent to someone with, maybe a barrier that they're a little more uncomfortable with, maybe a low credit score, maybe they have no rental history, this is designed to be an insurance policy. So the fund covers up to $1,000 for unpaid rent or damage beyond the damage deposit. So it'll cover that for a full year. And then after that, that $1,000 becomes available for another renter. It is a pairing. So the landlord has to be a property partner. It's really easy to become a property partner. It's just a form to fill out and then a couple of check boxes, what you're willing to reduce. And then the tenant has to take the rent-wise class. So trying to keep it as low barrier as possible. When I was chatting with another landlord liaison program out in the Oregon area, they really made sure that it was really important to have that education aspect for their risk mitigation fund as well. So this is just kind of a way to grease the wheels, a little bit of an insurance policy to hopefully get more folks in their home. I know Zeke, who's going to present next, they had a family that was able to access risk mitigation fund and actually were able to get into a home right before Thanksgiving, which was really exciting. So they do some really amazing work too. So I am going to pass it off to Zeke. We've got a really great partnership with them, with the Housing Advocate Network and with Zeke. This is a really fantastic program because they work with so many people in Missoula on all aspects of housing. So whether it's talking to a landlord or helping with applications, they do some amazing work. So I'm going to let Zeke take the reins and talk a little bit more about the Housing Advocate Network.
Thanks, Alex. And if we can just say on this slide, just briefly, I think for the purposes of this audience, just a brief kind of my goal here is to maybe expand the imagination of two things. One is, we have a culture when we're talking about housing and homelessness, we have really important institutions and agencies and resources and professionals. So we have case managers, and we have all these people that are doing this really good work. And yet that represents what I see over the past decades and maybe even hundreds of years. Our social services have gone away from neighbors helping neighbors, and neighborhood organizations and churches and parishes providing social services to a more professionalized approach to providing services, which has been really helpful and efficient. But we've lost a lot of that person-to-person type of support along the way. So I work for an organization called Missoula Interfaith Collaborative, which about 10 years ago started out with this concept of community organizing. One of our leaders brought together a whole bunch of different faith organizations in Missoula that, for example, had their own food bank with one another, so that those food banks could be structured in a way where every weekend there would be a different food bank. And that's just a small example, but now much broader than faith organizations. MIC includes like the local health center. It includes neighborhood organizations. It includes unions. There's 35 different institutions that are part of our membership base. And what we do is we all look at each of these organizations and institutions and their own siloed services, the food bank, partnership health center, et cetera. and recognize that within that, there's a lot of commonalities and shared values, and stresses and pressures that the people that they serve are managing. And housing is far above and beyond the most shared pressure of providing social services to folks in Missoula. Again, whether we're talking about physical health, we're talking about mental health, food, access to food, childcare, transportation, housing is really deeply impacting all these different areas. And so from the community organizing perspective, we were able to get all these institutions together to say, hey, what can we do to address housing? We're not professionals. What is our role? And so the Housing Advocate Network was born. And the Housing Advocate Network is a coalition of everyday people from these different institutions and just folks that are in the community who are willing to put themselves into relationship with folks that are experiencing homelessness or at risk of experiencing homelessness. And Alex, you can now proceed to the next slide. I think that's what is explained in the next slide, if I remember correctly. Yeah, so this is what the Housing Advocate Network is. It's a pushback against the culture of service provider and consumer. And it's a pushback against the idea that as people in the community facing this community issue, that the best way we can help is by voting in the right politician or supporting, funding. Those things are all really important, tax dollars and policies and stuff. But at the same time, while we're waiting for those policies to be sorted out and programs to be implemented, why can't just one neighbor reach out to their neighbor who's under pressure and just sit with them and walk alongside them through their housing insecurity? And so that's what we do. I have a team of about 60 to 70 volunteers, and they are not professionals. They are church people, they are retired people, they're business people, and I match them with individuals and families experiencing homelessness. And at the foundation of what they do is they go and get to meet them and know them, normalize their experience, help identify their strengths, and then be a cheerleader. We can look for resources and learn about resources in the community right alongside them. We can refer them to RentWise if credit is an issue that they're facing. If income is an issue, we can explore with them different ways that they might be able to, increase their income. We can coordinate with their case manager or what other services, rather than them being sent and referred in circles and going around and trying to figure out this stuff on their own. The Housing Advocate Network is about just people walking through this process with another person. And so right now we kind of have three really kind of structured areas that we work. So if we can go to the next slide, you may have heard that Missoula last week or 9 days ago opened a new shelter for families experiencing homelessness. We had a couple programs that were providing limited services and they weren't ideal. And now we have a new building, that was 5 or 6 years in the making and took a lot of money and a lot of time, and it is open. And so the 50 to 60 families who are experiencing homelessness on any given night in Missoula, half of them now have a place that they can come immediately to stay and get support. And within that, they're going to get the professional support of a case manager and access to other resources. But there's also going to be a team, 2 or more hand volunteers, Housing Advocate Network volunteers, who go and meet with them, get to know their children. Maybe one of them is entertaining the children while the other one's helping fill out applications. Maybe they have some confusion about what their case manager's been telling them. That's one place that we're working. The second slide, I think, is for Crosswinds, Transitional Living. More than 100 people come out of the incarceration system every year to Missoula. They've been told that they're rehabilitated and they're good to go. And yet they land here and the employer says, you can't work here. The landlord says, you can't live here. And they end up, taxing our homelessness services, and they end up back in situations that lead to relapse or lead to recidivism. And so we do have like Transitional Living, Crosswinds here in Missoula. Now every single person that comes out and lands at Crosswinds is matched with a Housing Advocate Network volunteer. who can pick them up from the bus, who can take them to Walmart to get their deodorant and toothpaste, who can talk to them about the bus system, connect them with employment, connect them with housing, connect them with a mental health provider, whatever needs it is that they have. And then a third kind of group that we've been working with, we've had a little bit of challenges because access and kind of surfacing this population has been more challenging than I recognize. But Alex, on the next slide, I think we talk about the transitional age youth. 25% of a sample population coming out of the foster care system ended up in homelessness because they don't have rental history or credit history or family supports. Sometimes it's who you know, or sometimes, you know, it's really helpful to be connected with community. And when you're coming out of a system and you're not connected with community, what the Housing Advocate Network is trying to do is kind of build that community and make that community happen. And there isn't a slide for this, but I know that all along, I was just talking with one of my volunteers, all along for the last 2.5 years, we've also just been working with individuals and families who are experiencing homelessness that aren't connected to one of these institutions. And that's been hard work, but we're doing it and we've had some success. And then over the last 3 months, as this housing crisis has really taken off, the phone calls of people who are at risk of losing housing, whose leases are being terminated, whose property is being sold, is just, it's incredible. My phone calls of people reaching out for help has tripled probably over the last 3 months. And it's really, you know, stretched our volunteer base pretty hard. And it's also really spoken to, you know, gosh, if people like me, I'm a renter, are now at risk of losing my housing because of rent increases or sold properties. Now I'm competing for the same housing with the folks who are staying at the local homeless shelter. So the problem, I think, on my end is really, really challenging and scary. And I can't imagine what it's going to look like as it unfolds. So my next slide, Alex, I can't remember what it is. Oh, so the Housing Advocate Network. We believe in housing as a human right. We believe very strongly that the scope and capacity of our program is about relationship building. We don't solve housing problems for people. We don't put people into housing. We don't have funding to pay for their housing. We don't do the work for them. We walk alongside them. We build power with them as they go through this process. And they get to have a cheerleader and a support person and someone to just connect with and maybe just vent to and share some of the frustrations and stresses of finding housing. A lot of the volunteers say, well, I don't know anything about resources. Well, the great news is that you get to learn about them alongside somebody who can really use these as far as like being a lifesaver, whether that's childcare or employment or getting a voucher and things like that. In addition, now we have a whole team of volunteers who understand the pressures and challenges of housing and homelessness. And they're able to share that within their congregations, their neighborhoods, their book clubs. We're building some really, you know, broad community awareness about what this looks like. And together as a team, both the volunteers and the people who are experiencing it are able to be a part of the conversation in terms of what kinds of systems changes and what kinds of other community needs need to happen in order to kind of slow down or you know, ultimately end this problem that we have with housing. And so that's kind of what we do. That's the principles of the Housing Advocate Network and what it means to be a hand volunteer. Next slide. So to kind of wrap up before I pass it off to Jane, I think a really good explanation that I found is we have these systems in place. So we have emergency shelters. We have camps. We have like really structured places for people that can go that are experiencing homelessness. And we have all these different affordable and subsidized housing options, the vouchers, you know, Section 8 vouchers, some of the projects that Homeword is helping develop. And then finally, we have so much money. You know, it's kind of laughable that there's like so much money is being pumped out, especially since COVID, to provide rental support and assistance, to help with utilities, to pay for application fees. And so we have all those you know, resources and systems in place. But then if we go to the next slide, what I'm finding and what my volunteers are finding is that, yeah, so we have the vouchers and rental assistance programs, but they're limited. They don't meet the need. They can provide some support, but not all the support that's needed. Even with a voucher or rental assistance, you're competing with 30, 40, 50 other applicants for a rental. And clearly because of the systems of property and property management and just general social power structures, the landlords often, there's not a lot of incentive outside of things like, Alex's program, for them to rent to somebody that's maybe not like them, or has maybe made some decisions in the past that put them in a compromised or vulnerable situation. We do have politics, for example, there was a lot of push, and I'm not going to get political here, but there was a big push in Missoula recently for how we could look at changing some zoning ordinances, or looking at how we can be more equitable in our zoning. And then we have a state legislature that creates a law that says that local governments aren't actually allowed to do that anymore. So we have the legislature to work with, we have city council, and we have just, typical not in my backyard attitudes with regards to housing, low-income housing, homelessness, and things that stand in the way to some of those important systemic changes. And then finally, we have just a general lack of community support, which doesn't mean that people are heartless. It's not what I'm implying at all. I just think that we've really moved in this direction of that service provider consumer attitude, and just kind of the breakdown of the social fabric and of relationships and of neighborhoods and of people being connected to one another, all of which has been exasperated quite a bit with COVID. So all those things would be examples of what's not working in our current system. And so I'll go to the next slide now. And I'm not going to read through all this stuff. I think that's my last one. Is that the last slide, Alex? Yeah, so I'm excited to introduce Jane Kisselbach. Jane has actually been a volunteer with the Housing Advocate Network for a lot longer than I've been even employed by Missoula Interfaith Collaborative. And she's done this work. And so she's here to share with you a little bit about the ways that she's found it to be helpful to be an advocate and working with folks who are housing insecure or experiencing homelessness. So Jane.
Okay, as Zeke said, I'm Jane Kisselbach. I'm a volunteer who's been working with MIC organizations for many years and in many different ways. I'm not a social worker, I'm not a counselor, I'm just a concerned citizen looking for ways to support those experiencing homelessness. The Housing Advocate Network is one of the MIC organizations that offered me an opportunity to do that and provided me with valuable training and ongoing support to do it. Although my focus today is on the Housing Advocate Network, MIC organizations interact and work together to provide services and lasting support for those experiencing homelessness. Over the years, I've worked with many individuals and families who are trying to find permanent housing and move on from a period of homelessness. Everyone has their own story, but there is some commonality in what they need from an advocate. Experiencing homelessness is a stressful and chaotic situation. When you don't know where you're going to sleep at night, and when you have choices, many times they're unsafe. It's hard to think clearly and create a plan for moving on when you're in a situation like that. When you're not sure what resources are available, and when you find one, you're told there's a lengthy waiting list. It's often difficult to keep trying. An advocate can provide needed support by meeting with the individual or family on a regular basis, listening carefully to their story, providing structure, and accepting them as they are. This builds trust, and trust is a key to any successful relationship. An advocate can share resources with the client based on their needs and encourage and support them in creating and following a housing plan. Searching for suitable listings can be a shared activity. Advocates can provide transportation when needed and accompany clients to meetings with potential landlords if requested to do so. Depending on the situation, being accompanied by an advocate shows the potential landlords that the client is supported and can help. An advocate can also check with their own contacts for assistance when application fees or a double or even triple sometimes deposit is required. Advocate support doesn't end when a client finds housing. If things are going, pardon?
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we heard from someone that they can't quite hear you. Do you mind speaking up a little bit?
Oh.
Your story is a good one. We don't want anyone to miss it.
Do I have to repeat or just go on?
I think you're okay to continue.
Okay.
Thanks, Jane.
I'll get a little closer. If things are going well, support can be just a periodic check in to see how things are going. If they're not, more support is needed. An example of this is a mother and 3 children I worked with. We found housing and things were going well for a while. Right before their lease was set to renew, the landlord told the family he was selling the property and their lease would not be renewed. I asked for and got another advocate to work with me on this because we only had a couple of weeks to find another place for this family of 4. When our searches turned up a promising listing, we all worked together to make a case for this family. We knew approval wasn't going to be easy because the mother had no income, although she had one of the really good vouchers. We gave copies of reference letters to the property management company that had that listing. We contacted a number of churches, local agencies, and individuals to help with the double deposit that was required. And with their help, we were able to cover that deposit. And much to our collective relief, the family was approved. A local church moved the family free of charge, although another group within Missoula Interfaith Collaborative called Missoula Works, Get It Done Crew, was standing by to help with that move if we hadn't had this offer. We're still checking in with this family and are providing ongoing support when it's needed, which fortunately it hasn't for a while. And knowing we're there seems to help them. The following is an excerpt from a letter from another client that wrote us. It shows how important encouragement and support can be. She wrote, "Every day we were looking for available listings. It was getting harder and harder to the point I wanted to give up. I started to feel there was no hope and that I was alone. I felt I couldn't take care of my kids. One day, a volunteer told me how brave I was to keep fighting. She said I was a true survivor. I went to bed that night and did a lot of thinking because of those words. I woke up and kept trying because that volunteer did not give up on me." She ended her letter with, "Thank you for keeping my flame going and not letting it burn out." Having an opportunity to work alongside families such as these, provide support when needed, and being at least a small part of their successes keeps me coming back for more. Zeke.
Thank you, Jane. So you heard a little bit from Karissa about kind of the nature of what the housing crisis in Missoula is looking like and what that means, its impact. And you heard from Alex about some programmatic types of solutions that are new and innovative, that really support landlords and that provide incentives and opportunities for landlords to provide housing for people who, maybe quote unquote risky renters from their perspective, and some of the other supports that Homeword provides. And then you heard from me about the Housing Advocate Network and Jane as a volunteer. And so the purpose, I guess, there's 2 parts to, I guess, what our final ask is one is how you guys represent a whole bunch of different organizations across the state. How can you be inspired to think imaginatively about new ways of supporting landlords and new ways of supporting renters and making those connections? And how can you bring the community on board in a structured and supported way so that that we are all rolling up our sleeves? We're seeing housing and homelessness as a community problem that can that's going to require a community solution. So what will that look like in your community, and how can we inspire folks to get out there and just build these supportive relationships and connect people to these innovative supportive programs? And then finally, I guess in the name of self-interest, our final ask is, especially for those of you who are in Missoula, we need more people to be a part of Alex's programs, and we need more volunteers to be a part of the Housing Advocate Network. And so, are you a landlord? Are you a property manager? Do you know a landlord or property manager? Do you have friends or coworkers or or colleagues who own property that they lease out that might want to know more about these programs? Or are you someone who could take an hour or two out of your week to build a supportive relationship with someone like Jane has done in order to help folks navigate housing and connector resources? If you are, then I think, we're all going to leave our contact information here in the chat. And I just encourage you to reach out, ask some questions, learn more about these things, see where you fit in with all of it, and just open up that conversation and explore where you fit in with that. I think that's kind of the end of what we have. I don't know, Karissa, Alex, Jane, if there's anything else you wanted to add to that before we open it up to questions.
I want to make sure Jane reads the chat because you're getting a lot of really great shout outs in there.
I did. Thank you so much.
Good. I don't think I have anything to add, Zeke. Thanks. I'd love for folks to, turn your cameras on and have a conversation with us. Are you doing something similar in your communities? Do you have questions about the creation of these two groups? Anything like that?
Hey, Karissa, it's Eric in Billings. Just a question for you as a group. I think one of the things I'm wondering about is just some distinguishing factors, if there are, between kind of the housing navigator and landlord liaison, and how you just have seen that from a an approach standpoint, if you will. If you have some distinguishing things you could talk about there.
I work pretty closely with the housing navigators. I go to the weekly case conferencing group. I'm on the Slack channel just in case, a rental becomes available. I can send that out to various case managers and around the community. But yeah, I have a pretty close-ish relationship with everyone on that side of things.
And Eric, I have a really great visual. I am officially on maternity leave, but if you email me, I will get it to you as soon as I can. And it's about how the landlord liaison, housing navigator, and housing retention specialist positions are sort of a triad in a solution that a community can employ to address homelessness. And it's a pretty nice visual of, like, again, kind of this spectrum of support to really get those folks who are considered higher risk. In Missoula, our housing retention specialist is focused on the highest need individuals. And so the Missoula Interfaith Collaborative's Housing Advocate Network fills the gap there within that continuum that I can definitely provide that visual for you. If you want to just shoot me an email, I'll put my email in the chat.
Great, thanks.
We do have a question in the chat. I want to make sure to get there. How would we go about creating an advocacy group for our county?
Yeah, I think I can answer that. The name's Hazel. So I don't know how to address. I don't know if that's a he or she, but I do appreciate your question. I'm curious which county that you're referencing. If you could put in the chat or turn off your mic or turn on your mic. Well, okay, so yeah, in Billings, that's great, because I think that I do believe that it's easier in a more largely populated county than some of the rural ones. And so we're talking, there's another question in there, are there any other groups like the Housing Advocate Network in other parts of the state? And there's not, because it takes a lot of work to build this, but it's not impossible. What it means is becoming learned about what community organizing looks like, which is not as abstract as it sounds, but how do you go and share about community needs and help the different institutions and organizations recognize in Yellowstone County how deeply they're all impacted by housing and homelessness issues, and then bringing them all together and say, hey, we're all experiencing this, and we can all work together to address this. So it's challenging, but it can be done, and that's how it was done here. It's actually a practicum student at the university who built Missoula Interfaith Collaborative. When you're talking about social work, there's micro level social work, which is the one-to-one direct support of folks. But then there's like a macro level, which is community. So what can the community do to address social needs? And I guess to those of you who are asking that question, I would encourage you to reach out to me, and I would be glad to have a separate discussion with you about building something like that in your county or community. And I would also invite you sometime to come and see the Housing Advocate Network for yourself, see what our orientations look like, what our trainings look like, see a little bit about what the volunteers are committing to. Because I do think that as an abstract idea, it can be really challenging, but once you get into the weeds and actually see, it's really just about knocking on doors and helping people understand why they can be involved, and then turning them out to be a part of a program that's going to address that. So I'll put my email in the chat window again, because I know it's kind of sinking down low, but I'm happy to talk more about how you might organize something like that in your community. And then there was another question about the new family housing center. The Meadowlark is actually 3 wings in one building. And so wing number 1 is actually, it's the YWCA's new administrative and program offices. And wing 2 is the new shelter for domestic violence. And so that is one of the wings. And then the 3rd wing is what's called the Family Housing Center. And that's that provides the capacity for up to 31 families who are experiencing homelessness to come and stay. So, so both.
Okay, so it looks like for the most part, I think we've answered the questions. Folks are just wondering if there are any other groups like the Housing Advocate Network. And Zeke, to my knowledge, you guys are the only like really kind of organized group in town. I know that there are, like you've said, kind of more formal organizations that offer this, but as far as a volunteer group, do you know of any others?
I don't. I don't. And so, I mean, it's important to just recognize that the Housing Advocate Network isn't an organization in and of itself. Missoula Interfaith Collaborative is the organization. And within Missoula Interfaith Collaborative, we're addressing employment. We have an organization called Missoula Works that takes people with barriers to employment and puts them directly into jobs and builds contracts with organizations who are willing to hire them. We have, Family Promise, which is a program that provides housing and supports to families experiencing homelessness. We have the Housing Advocate Network. That's the volunteers working one-on-one with individuals and families in the community. So the Housing Advocate Network is not sustainable just as an organization by itself, but as a program of a larger organization that's bringing these different churches and nonprofits and social service agencies together to the table. That's where we come up with community solutions that we want to work together to build. And so the Housing Advocate Network is a program that was built by MIC and all of its participating organizations.
Thanks for the shout out, Mary.
There was a question, I think you might have already answered that, about how to start. Yeah, Edith's question, it sounds like you already gave her some contact information.
Yep, and I'd love to verbally say, just give a quick response to what Thomas said. He said, is there anything out there that explains each voucher and what they cover? There's so many different types, and we agree. And then there's, COVID money over here, and there's city or county funded money over here, and it all changes every week. And it's so hard to know. And really, we've heard this time and time again, like, can someone create a resource document? And the answer is always, but who's going to keep it updated? Who's going to know all of those things? And, if the HRC has a resource that runs out, are they going to remember to tell whoever's managing this document? And, and so we've started utilizing 211. It's a statewide resource. It's a one place that you can go to make sure that they have updated information about any program you're running. And then that's also a public resource. So if you don't know the answer to something, you could have a client or a colleague or whomever reach out to 211 to ask what services are available. Here's my situation. What services do you know that are available? And so that's been a resource that we've really started relying on fairly heavily, as that's who you call to update. And that's who you send folks to if you don't have the answer immediately, because there's so much confusion out there for sure. Zeke, it looks like another question for you on Han. Alex, did you have something to add real quick?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something just verbally also, in case people aren't in chat. If folks are interested in taking Rentwise, please come and take it. I actually recognize a couple of names in here of folks that have taken the class already. If folks are interested in seeing what I teach, please come on by. I'm also willing to help out if folks want to teach some kind of rent-wise class in their community as well. I'm definitely willing to help for that. I definitely got a lot of information from other communities around the US as well, as far as like what they teach. So definitely willing to help out with that. So yeah, I teach it twice a month on Thursdays at either 3 p.m. or 5:30 p.m. And my next one is actually tomorrow. And you can find that at homeword.org in classes and services.
And to your question, interaction with the private business community, I was challenged by that question initially, but I guess when I think about it, I have a downtown business owner whose business he feels like is impacted by homelessness. And so he's a volunteer. I have a couple real estate agents who feel like they share this, and I don't know how true or not, but they feel like they're part of the problem of like the housing and the situation here. And so one of the things they do is they volunteer to work with the Housing Advocate Network. And then we have teams of businesses who go into the new family shelter and provide meal services to the families. So there are several really community-centered, community-oriented businesses and business organizations in Missoula that are committed to how they can roll up their sleeves and get involved. But in terms of being organized as the private business sector to address housing and homelessness, I don't know. Karissa would actually probably know more than I would.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're hitting the nail on the head. We see chunks of folks in the business sector who are interested in helping support efforts. And we've had really great luck with the Missoula Organization of Realtors. If you all have a community-based organization of realtors, I would highly recommend reaching out to them. Like Zeke said, whether they feel like they're part of the problem or they just care about their community and want to be a part of the solution, that's definitely a group that's there and has been present in a lot of these conversations and trying to get some solutions. We see the interesting thing that we're seeing right now is actually we see business owners connecting with us for our financial education program. Whether it's that they are challenged to pay living wages and they know that, or during COVID, they had to cut employee hours and they knew that was negatively impacting their employees. And so we had a lot of referrals to what is now a statewide financial education program. But it's a constant battle of getting people engaged in these conversations. So there's nothing, I think, systematic in place. But we're seeing a lot of business owners who care about it. This is their community and they want to see everyone in the community succeed.
And just to mention that we have been asked to do a similar talk to community organizations. And there were a lot of business people in there. One of them was our Midtown Business Group. So
great point. Yeah, thanks, Jane. Great point. Any other questions out there that we can answer? Lots of follow-up available. So if folks have questions about the Missoula Interfaith Collaborative's Housing Advocate Network, Zeke just put his information in the chat. Alex can put his email in the chat again. If folks want to hear a little bit more about the Property Partner Program, the Risk Mitigation Fund, or the landlord liaison position in general rent-wise. And then I'm happy to send that graphic to anyone. If you all could email me, I put my email in, but I'll do it again. I'm happy to get that done before I eke out on maternity leave. We can end 7 minutes early.
Did anybody find anything inspiring or exciting or something new that you learned that you wrote down on your little whiteboard paddle or on a piece of paper that you guys want to share with the group? You can put it in the chat or turn your camera on and show us. Joe. Looks like Joe gave you guys a round of applause. So good job to you guys. Anybody have any more questions before we end the session? Well, I think you guys have their contact information. If a question does come up, I know that they'd be more than willing to chat with you guys offline. But thank you all so much for joining us for this session. Remember, you guys can always participate in a community conversation through the Whova app to chat more. And we're now going to take a half-hour break and return back at 2:30 for their closing plenary session. Ugh, can't even say that word. Plenary session. So if you guys have any questions from now until then, we would love to hear from you in the chat, communicate that way. Otherwise, we are looking forward to seeing you guys for our closing session at 2:30.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for attending.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Great job.